This is the final of 4 presentations on Art History 101, European art, medieval through 18th century. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you to all of you who have attended all of them, all 4. Thank you to anyone who's come for any selection of them. But today we are talking about the 18th century, which is a very exciting century with a lot going on in terms of the history of art, always with a view towards what I know, what my specialties are and what I know, and things that are reflected in the collection, in the CMA's collection. So I think that we'll talk about, in the 18th century, the Rococo. We'll talk a little bit about neoclassicism, a little bit about romanticism. At the end, I have a little quiz. It's just like, it's very, very low stakes and silly, just a couple of questions to see if after this time you'll recognize something that is medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, or 18th century. Okay, so with all those caveats in place, I saw yesterday in the New York Times, the wonderful writer Elizabeth Egan was talking about this new trend in book cover designs where you have usually an 18th or 19th century painting with an overlay of some kind of bold or neon font. And it was funny to see the number of kind of relevant paintings to this talk that were here. Some of you may know this painting by Fuseli, The Nightmare. Interestingly, they took out the demon, which to me is the whole, the raison d'etre for this painting. But I was really thinking, in terms of identification, if you see a woman who looks like she has no bones, right, just no bones in her body, just kind of like, flopping, it's very likely that it's an 18th century, maybe 19th century, but this is very 18th century to me. So the way that we've gotten started traditionally with these talks is I have asked a specialist in this area to comment on what they love about their era. And this week we have Stephen Ostro, who is a friend, and he's a professor emeritus from the University of Minnesota. He's worked on a number of exhibitions. And when I kind of put the call out, I enjoyed, well, I'll show you. I enjoyed his response because he had a lot to say about a lot of different things. So here's what he said about what do you love about 18th century art. He said, what I love about the Rococo is the variety of style and the question of whether it is utterly artificial in its aesthetic or rooted in nature. Visually, one can draw parallels between certain Rococo things, the Rocaille, the Arabesque, and Art Nouveau, but the Rococo is different, unique. It grows out of the Baroque, but is distinct. What I also love about 18th century European art is that it moves away from the church and becomes highly personal, subjective. I'm also a great fan of the erotic vein in 18th century French art, particularly Fragonard's erotica. And his fantasy portraits are utterly amazing, dashed off in a few seconds, or so he liked to claim. I told him that we have some of these Guardi, Bellotto, Panini. He says, Guardi, Bellotto, and Panini are all wonderful vedutisti, or view painters. And as much as I am a Romanist, and I love Panini's view of the Pantheon and other monuments, Francesco Guardi is truly sublime. And so we'll look at that from this collection a little bit later. I would always tell my students that the vedute of Venice, the views of Venice especially, were the very expensive postcards of their time. Every proper grand tourist simply had to have one or more on their wall. And I neglected to mention the humor in 18th century art, whether that of Pietro Longhi poking fun at the aristocracy, or the singerie in French art, not to mention chinoiserie, etc. So what I loved about this answer is the muchness of it, right? Like it seems very, very appropriate to the Rococo and to the kind of exuberance of detail that we associate with it. And so Stephen gives us a lot of things that we could possibly follow here. But like I said, I want to think a little bit about the roots of the Rococo, where that comes from, out of the Baroque, Neoclassicism, and Romanticism. So, maybe this is someone, oh, it's too bad we have the URL at the top, but sorry about that. So the break between Baroque and Rococo, and of course none of this really happens in a totally linear kind of fashion, but it really straddles the reign of Louis XIV or Louis XIV. The 18th century is a time of great tumult in France. There's the wars of the Spanish Succession, the League of Augsburg, other things that were very damaging. Louis XIV, or Louis XIV, dies in 1715. And they're going back and forth between Versailles and Paris. So when we're thinking about the 18th century and Rococo, we're really thinking about these two monarchs in France. And what a portrait this is, right? This is the height of kind of artificiality here and of the absolute ruler, and nobody's going to tell him anything about his appearance. And it is, again, it is highly, highly constructed and artificial. He's not trying to be one of us. And this is really one of the icons of what's sometimes called portrait d'apparat or ceremonial portraiture. And he liked this so much that there are two copies of it. This one was sent to Madrid. So he has, obviously, wig, right? We have this wonderful long wig. It is obviously artificial. It is not his own hair. We have this beautiful costume with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, on it. We have a cloth of honor arranged just so behind him. A ceremonial sword that was supposedly owned by Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. The column that represents fortitude. There's the crown. And he's in this wonderful stance. So we've seen, going back to the ancient world, that contrapposto stance, right, where you have one foot over which the body is centered and then one foot at rest. And here it's a little bit, we have a little bit more turn and dynamism to the body. And he is showing off his legs, right? The costume is made in such a way that it's showing off his legs, his beautiful shoes. I tried to wear shoes that were as close to a Louis XIV style as possible. And it's important to know that he was a dancer. He was a performer himself, and he really wanted to show this off, that he was absolutely of the moment and fashionable, and that he was this performer, the Sun King. And there's a beautiful movie, I think the English translation is just The King's Dance, about this particular performance of the Ballet de la Nuit. And it really, it's historical fiction, but it really beautifully reconstructs what this performance would have been like. And you have people who are favored at court who have to come and dance around the king, and there are fireworks, and just absolute spectacle and display. But again, as kind of ridiculous as some of these things might have seemed, they were really, Louis would argue that they were not superfluous and that they were supposed to induce awe in the viewer. They were supposed to reinforce the power of the state and of the ruler himself. So he could always justify these, absolute expenditures on all of these different things and these kind of spectacles. So behind is this representation of justice. And so that's really actually very important here because, again, you're thinking about the absolute ruler of the monarch and the fact that he can dispense justice. this was a portrait that you couldn't turn your back to, right? This was, this was part of this whole two bodies of the king kind of thing. So this was a very, very powerful representation or likeness of the king, and it is a projection of everything that he kind of wants people to believe about him, this kind of divine kingship. So we didn't talk last time about Versailles, but I just, maybe many of you have been there. Raise your hand if you've been to Versailles. Okay. So you understand the kind of overwhelmingness. The facade is just so incredibly broad. I like how this photo doesn't even encompass the whole thing. And it is deliberately very, very repetitive. Right, so it's not like it has lots of different architectural interests all along. It is supposed to be kind of monolithic and monumental, and again, reinforcing the power of the state and of the monarch. It's kind of meant to sort of inspire submission in the viewer. And you've probably, many of you, it sounds like, have been to things like the Garden at Versailles, which were these unbelievable, kind of fantasy places where people, there were citrus trees that had to be carried inside and outside, all these non-native plants that required just an absolute army of gardeners. So let's see. Maybe I'll show this in this order instead. Everything about the appearance and the presentation of the king, of Louis Couture, Louis XIV, was important. And even in his bedchamber, so here's his bed right here, you see that there's this balustrade there, which is not for modern visitors. It was for contemporary visitors because people would actually watch his morning routine, him get up, him get ready in the morning, very elite, people who were invited in. So his entire life was a performance. And that was going to be a very influential idea, especially in the courts and the upper classes of French society. So at the beginning of the Rococo, you have this real emphasis on surface ornament, right? Surface ornament, even at the level of, cosmetics and how you adorn yourself, being very, very important. So your, your toilette in the morning might take a very long time and might be witnessed by other people. So, dressed, hair, wig put on and powdered, cosmetics applied, jewelry put on, costume, all of these things. It was really this kind of mask that you put on that advertised your social status. And it was something that eventually the lower strata of society were going to try to copy and try to kind of indicate something about their own status as well. It got a little bit complicated. So it's all kind of trickling down from Louis XIV. So between these two emperors, you have this style that is definitely exuberant, right? It's using incredibly expensive materials. It has these kind of florid forms. And we eventually get to what we call the Rococo, which I've heard a few different things, and maybe someone can correct me here, but I believe it comes from rocaille, like the word for stone, and especially broken stone. That was sometimes, crushed stone that was used as a kind of parallel or analogy to the forms that they were creating. I've also heard that it's a combination of rocaille and coquille, meaning shell, because shell-like forms were also very popular in this period. But I think the important thing about the Rococo to understand is that it's not like it's coming from the so-called fine arts and then transmitting down to the decorative arts. It's really coming from the decorative arts. It's coming from furniture and stucco work and frames and It's decorative objects, porcelain, that we'll talk about porcelain in a minute, all of these things. So typical, you'll see these kind of shell-like forms, you'll see asymmetry, you'll see things that look like a kind of florid C or S shape. I'll give you some examples here. But this is the Blue Velvet Room at the Chiswick House in England. And these are some Chippendale designs for chairs that you see here that are, again, kind of hallmarks of the Rococo. So there was an art historian, Van Rensselaer, who talks about the idea that the Rococo comes from Kleinkunst, or from the little arts, rather than the other way around, which is really interesting. I was just looking around on the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website a few days ago, and this is just a pen and ink design for a frame. And I have no more information, other than it's 18th century French. But I think that it has so much to say about Rococo style, because first of all, you have this wonderful asymmetry, right? So, when you think of a frame, you think what what to imagine, right? A frame is symmetrical. I don't know if it was meant to be a picture frame or some kind of stucco or, some kind of ornament on a wall. But the asymmetry really stands out to me here. And then the other thing is this kind of really interesting relationship between what is artificial and what is natural. Because asymmetry exists in nature, and you can see that we have all of these tendril-like forms. They're often kind of riffing on like the acanthus leaf. So acanthus leaves are used in classical design at the top of columns, Corinthian columns, that kind of thing. And again, there are these kind of riffs here, but this would have been totally artificial, totally gilt, made of expensive materials. And so it's, although they are these natural forms, it would in other ways really express and draw attention to its artificiality, if that makes sense. So we can't talk about the Rococo without talking about porcelain. Any collectors of porcelain in the room? I know, okay, a little bit. And I know that one of our trustees who was here the last time is just a demon collector of porcelain, some of which might end up here one day. This is not something that I know a lot about, but is very, very important to the history of art. So obviously ceramic had existed since the Neolithic era, right? People have been firing clay for a very, very long time. But there was this porcelain, this kind of hard paste ceramic object was something that originally was developed in China and was hugely admired in Europe, since we're talking about 18th century Europe. And it was not something that had been recreated. They could not recreate the quality of porcelain that came from China in Europe for centuries. It had been a very important import item for a long time. This is Andrea Mantegna's Adoration of the Magi. And so this is from the late 15th century. And here, the Magi are supposed to come from different continents. It's supposed to be kind of exotic. And so the different kinds, maybe this is like a Mamluk, like a Islamic object. And then we have this blue and white Chinese porcelain. So these things are supposed to express the exoticness and the idea that they have come from really, really far away. And again, this was probably based on a real object that Mantegna might have seen, at court or something like that. And then certainly, so that's Renaissance. In the Baroque period, in the 17th century, we have the huge popularity of still life painting, where you have this kind of arrangement of objects, natural objects, food, game, all of the, and then glassware and ceramic objects as well. And so you often will see, especially blue and white Chinese porcelain that's been imported. And again, it just kind of projects something about the owner, that they have good taste and that they can afford these imported kind of exotic objects. So what happens in the 18th century is that they finally kind of crack it. And does anyone know the most famous porcelain manufactory in Europe? It's Meissen, that's right, so near Dresden in Germany. And so they finally seem to have recreated this kind of technique, very much based on Chinese porcelain. So these are directly under royal supervision. So Meissen in Germany, Sèvres in France, Capodimonte in Naples in Italy. So these are all, porcelain is this incredibly high status item. And you see a lot of really interesting, to me, not coming, not having studied this directly, sometimes my eyes can kind of glaze over when I'm looking at porcelain. But it's very, very important. And you see a couple of different things happening in the 18th century. So this is an example of 18th century Chinese porcelain that has been imported to France. And then in France, they make these mounts for it, right? So that is a Chinese porcelain in a French gilt mount. So it has this wonderful pedestal and lid and everything here. Then on the right, this is actually native European. This is porcelain that was made at Sèvres in France, once owned by Marie Antoinette. But it's a little bit hard to see. But the subject matter here is it's chinoiserie, right? It's vaguely Chinese or Eastern subject matter narrative here. And it's important to realize that the interest in Chinese art and subject matter was not kind of historical or intellectual. It really was about exoticism and a trend, right? So they're not super worried about getting everything 100% accurate when they're adapting these kind of Chinese subjects into a European context. So again, we have this really interesting idea that maybe it started with domestic design, furniture, decorative objects like porcelain with this kind of asymmetry, this kind of lightness or whimsy, let's say, the color palette, all of these different things. And really, you can't talk about the Rococo without talking about this painting by Fragonard. How many people have seen this painting before? Okay, many of you. This painting of The Swing, which is just this kind of pastel fantasy of a love triangle. So we have in this, really interesting garden that's made to look completely wild, and you have no real other sense of civilization, except for this little pucho here who's saying shh. So her husband is pushing her on the swing here. Obviously, she's dressed in, to the nines with this kind of hat, bergère hat that is inspired by a shepherdess, but at the very, very, the very, very haute level, high level. And then her lover is down here, and her shoe is coming off like this. Her little dainty foot, her shoe is coming off, and he is actually positioned in a very, very advantageous for him, I suppose we could say, spot. But it's playful and it's very erotic. And this idea of a kind of adulterous marriage, the love triangle, the subject of the love triangle in Europe was very old. In the medieval period, Tristan and Isolde, the whole idea of, you have to choose between your great love or your feudal lord, that kind of thing. But here it's treated with great kind of playfulness and whimsy. And so this is going to be the kind of thing that the Enlightenment is really going to turn up its nose at. They're going to say, no, we're not interested in such frivolities. Let me see. Oh, and so in the same article that I referenced earlier, Elizabeth Egan talks about this book, Seduction Theory, which you can see does a close crop of exactly that moment of the lover and the shoe flying off with that kind of bold font on top of it. I don't think it always works, but in reading the synopsis of this book, I feel like it was a good choice, a good cover art choice. So you can see this really kind of light, and again, I've used the word pastel palette that we're seeing here. And again, it all works, right? It works with the kind of whimsy, with the idea of love and a playful sexuality. And I should mention that not only was that kind of pastel color palette very popular in the 18th century, but the actual medium of pastel really came into its own in the 18th century as well. So pastel, maybe some of you have worked with it before. It's basically powdered pigment that's held together in little sticks with like gum arabic, something like that. And raise your hand if you're familiar with pastel, like oil pastel, some of you. So kind of like chalk, but with this kind of wonderful, crumbly, powdery texture. And this was something, it wasn't new to the 18th century. It had existed before. People like Leonardo had used it, but it was really much more used for sketches or for preparatory, light studies, that kind of thing, or, to have highlight on a drawing. It wasn't something that was used exclusively for a work of art. But there are a few figures that we can really thank for for pastel coming into its own. And one of them is this wonderful woman artist, Rosalba Carriera, who had an international career but was born in Venice. So she was the daughter of a lace maker, an embroiderer. She started out as a miniaturist. I have to mention, since we are the CMA, that she painted the lids of snuff boxes, because I know that we have this collection of snuff boxes that was traditionally in our Virtues and Vices gallery upstairs. So that was a really good kind of early education for her. And pastel, you have to kind of rough up the surface that you're going to draw on. Sometimes it would be this kind of prepared paper. Sometimes that was laid onto canvas. But it has this really wonderful, again, kind of immediate sketchy effect. Rosalba Carriera, so here you see a self-portrait, and really a double self-portrait, because that seems to be her as a younger woman there in her preferred medium of pastel. And she was someone who, from Venice, attained a really big circle of admirers and collectors, including royals from Saxony, from Vienna, from London, from Paris, and she worked in a lot of these international centers as well. And there are lots of examples luckily, there are lots of extant examples of Rosalba Carriera's pastel portraits. There was just a show at the Frick, I believe, and one could consult the exhibition catalog from there. But I really like this one that is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This is an Irish nobleman, the Viscount Boyne, who went to Venice. So this is when she was still in Venice. She began and ended her career in Venice. And he has come for Carnival, so for the celebrations leading up to Ash Wednesday before Easter. And so he is dressed up in kind of carnival costume with a tri-cornered hat with a little bow, and he's really showing off. He's feeling good about the way that he's dressed up here, and he wants this souvenir of this particular moment of him, going out to be this young nobleman partying at Carnival as this kind of international jet setter. And if we were to look more closely, I think you can see kind of the appeal of pastel as a medium here, because again, it's very sketchy and immediate. You can tell, you can see the strokes, the mark making, and the application of the pastel to the paper. It's very quick in terms of how she's defined the folds in the clothing with the highlight right on top. And the ruffle in the shirt here on the collar of the shirt, that actually has graphite, just like pencil, in that's kind of defining the detail within there. But again, it's very dynamic the way, so we have the torso facing one way and the head facing another. So you have that particular moment in time. And again, that particular moment of this nobleman's visit to Venice. So again, very, very attractive and appealing, and lots of examples that one could look at of Rosalba Carriera's pastel career. Another thing that I'll mention about this is that this old debate about line versus color that we had seen since the Renaissance, is line and contour the most important thing for defining form, or is color the main thing? Vasari would say that this was the Florentines versus the Venetians. The pastel was an answer to that color, again, would be more important than line in defining form and in creating art. So you'll see lots, Rococo could encompass a lot of things, again, from porcelain and decorative objects through portraits. And then we also have history painting here. It's secular painting and history painting. This is the so-called Triumph of Venus by Francois Boucher, who is represented in the CMA collection, not this painting, but another one I'll show you in a sec. And I just really, obviously, images of Venus go all the way back to the classical period, but we've never seen her quite this way. She really does look like a lady at court, right? An 18th century lady at court, surrounded by her, her coterie, her ladies in waiting. Again, it's very kind of whimsical. It's very playful, sexual. You have these kind of playful, I don't know, Narads? I can't remember what we would call these. But we have this beautiful pastel textile here, and this lady who really looks like an ideal beauty of her moment. And so often either Venus or Mary is depicted that way, right, as a kind of ideal beauty of their time. So this might seem frivolous, but frivolity was not a bad thing in the Rococo. It was actually something to be pursued and admired. And I wanted to give you an example, a 16th century example of Venus. This is actually Diana and her ladies in waiting. And this is Actaeon surprising Diana at her bath. And then this is an 18th century Rococo example. And they're not as far apart as one might initially imagine, but hopefully you can see things like the way that the human figure is so foregrounded here, and where it is less, it's taking up less of the kind of monumental space of the picture right there. And again, that kind of delicacy of form and treatment of both, the textiles and costume and of the human body itself. Oops. So, in terms of what's happening at the art academies in the 18th century, essentially at the beginning of the 18th century, there is this debate among the Poussinists, the kind of classicists, and the Rubenists. Now, I realized that when we talked about 17th century art and Baroque last session, I didn't talk about either of these. I didn't talk about Poussin or Rubens, and I apologize for that. But essentially what we're thinking about is really, again, this debate between line and color, right, that has existed at least since the 15th century. So this work by Nicolas Poussin is called The Death of Germanicus, and the classicism is really, really strong here because it is a match of a classical subject, the death of Germanicus, with classical form. So this could be easily, this could be inspired by a classical frieze on a sarcophagus, the proportions of the body, the costume. He's trying to be as historically accurate as possible and as kind of correct in creating this history painting and making both of those things, the subject matter and the form that it takes, as closely related as possible. So he's going to be a 17th century inspiration for 18th century neoclassicism. And another thing that I should mention is that all through this period, so we talked about kind of proto-archaeology in the Renaissance period, the Golden House of Nero, grotesques, things being unearthed, the Laocoon, but that continues to happen, right? So things continue to be unearthed, antiquities, and antiquarianism only grows stronger, and people continue to be inspired by the classical world well into the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. So again, I feel like we can't talk about the 18th century without at least mentioning David and the Oath of the Horatii. Who's seen this painting before? A few people maybe. So this is, again, this wonderful meeting of classical subject matter and classical form. It's a great example of neoclassical painting. It is about an ancient battle between Rome and Alba, right? But basically, these cities are going to send 3 representatives to fight the representatives of these other cities. And so the Horatii brothers are taking their oath that they are going to go and defend Rome. And so again, you have this wonderful, there's so much going on here. These swooning women. It's a subject that is described in Livy, so it has this kind of correct, classical, just like a very authentic kind of source, and again, done in a very, very classical style as well, with a kind of wonderful monumental human figure. So, a lot different from what Boucher is cooking up at around the same time. In terms of kind of Rubenists, so that we have the Poussin adherents and the Rubenists, I would say that, again, Boucher, and this is the one that is actually in the CMA collection, is a great example of that kind of color over line debate. So this is a really interesting painting for us to have. It's an early work by Boucher because, again, he is much better known for these kind of frivolous pastel Rococo paintings of Venus or of the senses or other things like that. But this is a history subject, right? And it's been identified as a lot of different things because we have people not in dress that doesn't necessarily look biblical, but I think probably the most likely subject here is the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible subject of Joseph presenting his father and brothers to the Pharaoh. And so, the historical imagination here is kind of going all over the place, right? He's not that worried about historical accuracy here, but you can see how things like these wonderful Solomonic columns, these twisted columns, that would be impossible to to recreate. They're not done according to a system of perspective. They're really there, it's very vibe-based. It's just, there are just these forms that are really defined by color. So this is even before Boucher joined the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. It's a nice early work. And what's interesting about the 18th century is that we have certain painters who are continuously known and who serve as inspiration throughout the period, like Poussin, like Rubens, 17th century painters. But then there are others that kind of fall to the wayside. So Velázquez would be one of those. So we looked at examples like Las Meninas last time. Vermeer. Johannes Vermeer was, very, very important in the 17th century in the Netherlands, and then really, again, kind of falls to the wayside and is rediscovered in the 19th and 20th century. So, just an interesting point of kind of historical fact. Now, with the Rococo, we're really thinking about this kind of native French style. And thinking about other things that are happening in the 18th century, we have a lot of people coming into continental Europe on what's called the Grand Tour. So we think particularly about kind of wealthy Englishmen coming on the Grand Tour, but eventually Americans are going to join on the Grand Tour as well. Germans, if you know Goethe, his Italienische Reise, right, writing about going into Italy. But really the principal destination of the Grand Tour was Italy. If you've ever read Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, it's just in terms of the itinerary that he makes in Europe and how he gets from one place to the other. He actually ends up all the way in Jerusalem at one point, but it's a really fascinating look into an American's kind of Grand Tour a little bit later. So within Italy, people would go to Venice, Florence, Naples, and very importantly, Rome. And again, that's not totally new. So if you remember when we talked about the 16th century, the Renaissance, we know that there were Flemish artists coming down to Rome to study antiquities, like Martin van Heemskerk. So we looked before at his study of the Torso Belvedere that's still in the Vatican, and you can see that he really defined himself as an artist. So this is a double self-portrait of him as an older artist and then him as a younger artist traveling to Rome and looking at the ruins of the Colosseum. He really defines himself as this artist who has visited Rome. So again, it starts, in the 16th century, but as a wider idea of how one can kind of enlighten and educate oneself, it really is an 18th century phenomenon. And again, ancient things continue to be unearthed. This is an example that I like because this is a couple from Charleston, the Izards of Charleston, who left late in 1774, and they commissioned the great American portraitist John Singleton Copley to depict them as connoisseurs of art on the Grand Tour. We have so many beautiful objects here, this very polished porphyry table with these gilt kind of Rococo classicizing ornaments. We have obviously the Colosseum in the background. We have this beautiful Greco-Roman crater, this big pottery object decorated in red figure behind. So everything, I don't remember what plans they're looking at, but they're really showing themselves as these kind of educated connoisseurs who have been to Rome, who have been on the Grand Tour. And so there were portrait artists that became their whole career, was basically doing portraits of grand tourists, of wealthy grand tourists. So someone like Pompeo Batoni, Batoni, would be an example of that. So on the Grand Tour, obviously, they're seeing all of these monuments. They're also seeing Renaissance art. This is the Palazzo Pitti in Florence with a very famous Madonna by Raphael. There's a 15th century painting, a copy made after it. And that was the kind of thing that a grand tourist could take home, right? So they would have a copy or a replica, a beautifully made one, of an important Italian work of art, right? So this one was purchased, this is much later, but it was purchased by an American woman from California and brought back and passed down in her family. And I should mention that in England, this wasn't always admired, this idea of the grand tourist who comes back with all of these kind of continental manners and costumes. And there was a word making fun of them, the macaroni. And if you've ever heard put a feather in his cap and call him macaroni, that's what they're talking about here. Someone who is someone who is putting on airs, essentially, and you know, continental European airs. And you can see how this caricature where he is completely kind of deformed and a laughingstock of society there. So again, not always considered a completely, it was something that could go too far, let's say. So in the CMA, we have a number of wonderful examples of view paintings that were made as souvenirs for grand tourists. And I just wanted to show a couple of them. Oh, unfortunately, I don't have the CMA accession number here, but it's here. It's probably from the 50s, I'm going to say, and in the Crest collection. So it's a great example of the kind of souvenir that a wealthy person might want to bring back with them. A hand-painted collection of monuments that they had seen, in this case, in Rome. And so these are all monuments that existed in different places. They were scattered all throughout Rome. And what Panini excelled in is creating these kind of capricci, where he would place them all together in a single landscape. And again, they have no actual relationship to each other spatially. This is a fantasy, an Epcot center that he has created here. So we have in the background the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. We have the Theater of Marcellus. We have the sarcophagus of Constantina, which itself had moved a number of times. And this is this beautiful porphyry tomb of the daughter of Constantine, who was known as the first Christian emperor in the 4th century, and has some very early Christian imagery on it. So shepherds and grapes that were understood as Eucharistic grapes, peacocks that had to do with turning away the evil eye and eternal life. So a very, very interesting object that people admired. And so you have this wonderful, again, this kind of fantasy or capriccio where people are just walking amongst these ruins and these monuments. They come upon, is this an ancient man? Is this, just an unhoused person here? But again, it is this lovely fantasy, and it would actually spur recognition and memories of these different monuments that people had visited along the way. And you might remember last time with Caravaggio, we were talking about this idea of the gallery picture, right? So this picture that was meant to be placed in like an interior pinacotheque and to be viewed by other men of taste, right? So, this is really one of these. It's really painting as painting, painting qua painting. And just in terms of kind of collection systems and things, there are other, Samuel Crest collected other examples by all of these painters that you're going to see. This is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's this view of the Pantheon with all these wonderful 18th century figures in there. It's probably one of the more famous Panini works. It's not so much a fantasy as this one, but it's always fun with the Crest collection when you visit other American art museums. You can kind of draw that thread among the collection that has been so widely dispersed. So probably the most successful view painter, and we can think back to Stephen Ostro describing these as the most expensive postcards of their time, and the vedute, or views. Probably the most successful one was Canaletto, who was from Venice again. And he specialized in these views of Venice, and again, mostly for wealthy Englishmen on the Grand Tour. And there's so much that one could say about this view of Venice. So the Molo is this stone quay along some of the most important sites in Venice. And maybe if some of you have been there, you might recognize some of these monuments here. So this is the Doge's Palace, or the Ducal Palace, that has this wonderful diapered stone, pink and white, ornamental decoration, this very kind of Gothic fenestration here. The twin towers of Theodore and Mark, the columns that are right there, then going to the Zecca, the Mint, the Church of the Salute, and then way down here is the Church of the Redentore. And what I want to say about this is that it might seem just totally observed, right? Like you could just stand at this vantage point and you can just take in all of these different monuments. But this is actually an impossible vantage point that the painter is assuming here. And so it really is done at this wonderful steep angle in order to take in as many monuments as possible, right? In this one sweeping view, you get like 7 or 8 monuments of Venice, very memorable monuments of Venice there. And it's, this is often called the scena al angolo, the scene at an angle. And you can see just what an absolute steep angle we're seeing here. There are lots of choices that one could make in choosing how to depict these monuments. Panini takes a different tack. But this was something that was derived actually from theater. And again, it has this kind of theatrical or dramatic effect. So you're not seeing, sometimes Canaletto, whose name was Giovanni Antonio Canal, but I mean, what a lucky name for a Venetian view painter, right? And he was called Canaletto, or Little Canal. It's not this kind of ceremony. It's not a particularly special day. You have people from different walks of life. You have gondoliers. Something that I really like that's very Venetian to me is you have the Doge's Palace, and then you have this really rustic knife grinder's stall that's right in front of it, right? So you have this meeting of the prince of Venice with the lower classes, right? The working people right there. You can see that the stone here is stained with algae because there is that high water, right, that would come and wash over the stone fairly frequently. And then you have this striped awning over this boat, which would be for the Doge or for the Prince of Venice. So we're just kind of in between, in the middle here. So it really is, again, although it is incredibly artificial, it is meant to be this kind of natural, just an observation of what some of the most important monuments in Venice look like. I wanted to show, I love looking through the Crest Foundation website, and Crest actually owned 2 almost identical views of the Molo by Canaletto. And the other one, I believe, is in the El Paso Museum of Art, but it has just this great provenance. So you can see that it was acquired in Venice by an Englishman, George Proctor, and then essentially by inheritance, it pings, it just kind of pings down the family tree to the Beauchamps, the Beauchamp Proctors, the Proctor Beauchamp, right, all the way down until Miss Sheila Ginevra Hilda Mary Barker Halo Beauchamp. The trustees sell it at Sotheby's in 1947. So it spends 200 years in the collection of this family. And then there's the Sotheby's auction, and Samuel Kress buys it in 1957. So it really did, it continued its kind of grand tour original, original intention, I guess, for a very long time here. And again, this is the one in El Paso, not the one in our collection. Another very different view painter from Venice was Francesco Guardi, and again, this is a work that is in the CMA's collection. And he was doing something very different, whereas he's still using kind of a steep angle, but he doesn't have he's not using that kind of precision. You can imagine Canaletto drawing the perspective lines on this in order to create this beautiful scena all'angolo. Whereas here you can see that Guardi is much more interested in things like the play of light and in observing Venice at certain times of day, and at just the overall kinds of values in terms of like pictorial values of this very unique city on the water. So you have, again, you don't have anything. It doesn't seem to be preparations for any particular kind of ritual or ceremony. This is the Dogana, the customs house. And then again, we have this wonderful church of the Salute, which at this time was less than 100 years old. And very, very low horizon, right? I mean, 2/3 of this painting is taken up just by sky, which is you really appreciate in Venice on these quays when you can look out at the water and on the sky. And then this collection of gondoliers here. And it's a very free and loose application of paint that's very different from Canaletto. I was in Zurich last month, and I was looking at this another work by Francesco Guardi, another view of Venice. And I just love, if you see the way that, say, the sleeve is defined here just by that kind of blob of highlight that goes over it, it coheres to us as these kind of discrete forms, and it's very, very recognizable. But when you look up close, it's this very pastoso application of paint, very thickly applied here, and with all these wonderful highlights that again are really recognizable as tack or as costume or whatever it is here, but no faces on any of these figures. I really love the signature here on this big crate, because he's making his artist's name really kind of front and center. He is a character in this scene, and I love signatures, and I just think Francesco Guardi is one of the best to ever do it. So very, very lucky. We also have a work by Bellotto, a Roman work that I didn't talk about, but we are very strong in these kind of view paintings in the CMA collection. So maybe, I guess I have two little things that I want to talk about towards the end here. And these regard things that are in the collection as well. Towards the end of the 18th century, you have the development of kind of a different relationship to things like the ruins of classical antiquity. And we would call this early Romanticism, and that's Romanticism with a capital R. So it really is about a kind of longing, a melancholy, and a feeling of loss. So it's not trying to reconstruct like Poussin or like David is trying to do. It is about feeling that distance between our contemporary world and what must have been the greatness of the ancient world. And a great example, he would probably hate it if I called him an early romantic, but I do believe Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who did this red chalk sketch after Hadrian's Villa, would be a great example of this. So in our collection works on paper, we have a few, I'm not sure exactly how many, but we have some wonderful etchings by Giovanni Battista Piranesi. And very luckily, in the university collection of rare books, we actually own the entire 27 volumes of Giovanni Battista Piranesi's opere, or works, as they're called. So it is something that I and some colleagues have been working on digitizing for a long time now, doing translations and digitizing of these amazing images. The volumes are huge like this. And so I would encourage all of you to look at digitalpiranesi.org. I'll have his name up on the screen in a second. But so someone like Andrea Palladio in the 16th century is looking at, he's going to Hadrian's Villa, right, which is this enormous, second century villa that for a Roman emperor that is largely in ruins. And he's seeing something different. He's making plans of the island enclosure, and he's thinking about how it works symmetrically and taking measurements and things like that. But Piranesi is going and he's looking at something different, right? He's thinking about the ruin, the decay, the fact that there is, there's plant life that's growing out of the rock now. He's thinking about it as it exists, but giving a great kind of monumentality and dignity to it at the same time. So we own some examples from the Vedute di Roma, the views of Rome, right? So again, it comes from that same grand tour kind of experience. These etchings are things that someone could collect on the grand tour. And again, they often employ these kind of steep angles, the sena al angolo, and he's really trying to be an archaeologist here. So he's really trying to say, this is what this was. He's identifying things. And this is a really great example. So he's saying that this is the view of the remains of the dining room of Nero's Golden House, when in fact, we know that this is the remains of the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. And it's a really good example of an idea that people didn't know. People often didn't know, and it wasn't well documented what these ancient remains were, right? It was very easy for them to be misidentified, and in some ways we're still working through that today. The Pantheon in Rome has an inscription to Marcus Agrippa from the 1st century, from the first Pantheon that was built under Augustus. But the Pantheon was actually, the current one was actually built under Hadrian, and that confused people for a very long time. They thought it was a lot older than it actually was. So you really see when you're flipping through these works, like the Views of Rome by Piranesi, that kind of working through that, again, that kind of archaeology of trying to understand better in an enlightened way the ancient world. So really kind of working between Enlightenment and Romanticism. And Piranesi was also a wonderful kind of fantasist, and he would do also these kind of capricci, these capricious works, putting together Roman monuments or Roman motifs, sculpture, that kind of thing, and creating these fantasies. He also did really interesting work of prisons, these fantastic prisons that have traditionally inspired, there have been operas based on them. There have been works by, by surrealists and things. So Piranesi, very, very interesting author. I'm not sure. I'm hoping that he'll be up when the permanent collection galleries reopen, but I'm not sure. So the last thing that I wanted to mention, so we've done the kind of baptism by fire hose of the Rococo, neoclassicism, and then early Romanticism. But the other thing that I wanted to mention that's very important about the 18th century is that this is when we actually start to see museums and public museums like the one that we are standing in today, right? So generally speaking, what became major museums were once princely collections, right? So they belonged to the state. In one case, a university collection. But I just wanted to give you some dates and some sense of how important the 18th century was to this whole idea. So the Capitoline Museum in Rome, which was a papal collection, right? It belonged to the Pope, was first opened to the public in 1734. And this is the head of Constantine in the courtyard of the Capitoline Museums, if you've ever been there. Oh, two came up at once, that's fine. So the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, this was a university collection, a lot of natural history that was endowed by Ashmole, Lord Ashmole. And so actually opened to the public in 1683, and then a second museum that was actually meant to be a museum with different collections in 1860. The Uffizi in Florence was the collection of the Medici family. It was part of the palace of the Medici family, right by the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence, right by the Arno River, and had housed Medici collections on its upper floors for really a century already, maybe since the 1590s. And they would have invited guests in, but it was opened up to the public, made a public museum in 1767. And then finally the Louvre, which of course was the royal and state collection, was opened in 1790. Oh, why did I do that in such a, does that say 1790? No, 1780. Anyway, sorry. No, wait, it would have to be 1793 because it was after the French Revolution. So these collections already existed, but thinking about what makes a museum and a public museum is this kind of professionalization and bureaucracy in order to open to the public. So things like, these, in order to move from princely collections to museums, they needed guides written by experts in the field. They needed professional curators. They needed restorers. They needed signage. They needed physical things to guard. They needed gates and balustrades and things like that. And these museums had a really pretty ambitious goal, which was, really an Enlightenment goal for the study and the elevation of taste of the general public. So again, this is all really in line with Enlightenment values. Museums, of course, have a lot of say over how they present the history of art, and there are different ways of doing it. So you could do a chronological kind of universal survey, right, trying to show the entire history of art through objects. This museum, they try to work with the collection that they have, and they have these kind of thematic galleries. There are some that try to recreate those kind of princely collections with the great salon, with the masterpieces of the collection all in one room. But important to realize that a museum is not a neutral space at all, and it is very much a product of the 18th and the 19th century. And again, so much of what we've looked at in European art from the medieval period through the 18th century is the result of the collecting practices and donations of Samuel H. Kress, who gave most of his collection to the National Gallery of Art and then dispersed the rest of it to cities and universities where there was a Kress department store. All right, are we ready for our pop quiz? It's not anything to hand out or anything. So I think I have three. Well, first, are there any questions about 18th century before we? Okay. So I think I have three works to show you. They're not works that we looked at in these previous sessions. And I just want to see if you can identify, are they medieval? Are they Renaissance? Are they Baroque? Or are they 18th century? So you can just very subtly do it, but hold up, one finger for medieval, 2 for Renaissance, 3 for Baroque, 4 for 18th century. All right, here's number 1. All right, based on what we talked about, so medieval would be sort of 11th through 14th century, Renaissance, 15th, 16th century, Baroque, 17th, and then 18th century. Do we believe that this portrait is medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, or 18th century? All right, so let's hold up. So one for medieval, 2 for Renaissance, 3 for Baroque, 4 for 18th century. All right. If you chose 2 Renaissance, you were correct. This is a 16th century portrait of Baldassare Castiglione by Raphael. And we looked at a number of these kind of single portraits like the Mona Lisa, half-length, bust-length portraits, really celebrating the individual. All right, number 2, this work on vellum. Is this work medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, or 18th century? So 1 for medieval, 2 for, 3 for 17th century Baroque, 4 for 18th century. Okay. So based on things that we've looked at, this is a medieval work. So this is from the so-called Hedwig Codex of Hedwig of Silesia. So this is done on vellum, and it's one of these kinds of manuscript illustrations that we saw related to the books of hours that we saw in our first session here. I really love Hedwig. Is such an interesting. She was a kind of wealthy woman who gave it all up and went shoeless through the snow and prayed the rosary all the time. And she's holding all these different things. It's a really, really interesting figure, Hedwig of Silesia. All right, last one. All right, we have this group portrait of a family and their coterie. Is this medieval, Baroque, or medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, or 18th century? All right, if you chose Baroque, number 3, that is correct. This is Franz Hall's painting of a family in 17th century dress, and it is that kind of interesting group portraiture, right, that we saw from the 17th century or Baroque era, with a kind of interesting studied informality and a very large format. Maybe you're thinking of things like Velázquez's Las Meninas, where they also have the figure of someone who was a servant to the family included as well. All right, so if no one has any questions, that is it for our wonderful series of Art History 101. Thank you again for coming, and I would be happy to take any questions.